So welcome to this dialogue that's part of the book on evolution science and contextual behavioral science of reintegration. And the topic that we're talking about today is learning, one of the most important areas of overlap, I think, if you were to make a Venn diagram between these areas. And we have two strong teams, not a complete set. One of the authors is not able to be here, but a very powerful set of chapters, and we're looking forward to the dialogue. I'm going to ask the attendees here to introduce themselves and just say a little bit about their interest in this topic and background, and then we'll get right into the summary of the chapters and a discussion. So in no particular order, Eva, would you like to introduce?
Yes, my name is Eva Jablonka, and I'm from Tel Aviv University. I'm a geneticist by training, and I have been working for a long time on epigenetics, on various ways of information transmission that are not only based on variations in DNA sequence. I was interested, and I am interested in the evolutionary aspects of this type of the various routes of transmission, and the way that we have to understand evolution when we take this type of things into this type of processes into consideration. There's different routes of transmission. So I have been working on that, and I wrote about that quite a lot with my colleague Marian Lam. And in the last I would say 12 years, I have been during this work on different inherited systems, I have been writing about social learning and learning through association with other individuals from the same species and from other species, as well as learning that is mediated through symbolic representation and communication. And this has led me to a lot of thinking about learning and about the role, about the very important role of learning in evolution. And also, I have become very interested in a very big question, the question of the origins of phenomenal consciousness, the ability to have phenomenal subjective experiences, beginning with very, very simple experiences of smelling something, having pain, and so on. So I have, for the last 12 years, with my colleagues, Simona Ginsburg and Zohar Bronfman, who was a student and has just finished 2 PhDs, one in cognitive science and one in philosophy of science. We have been thinking about that and thinking about the role of learning and the role of cognition in the structuring and in the roles of cognition and learning in the emergence of minimal phenomenal consciousness. And it is within this framework that we have looked again at a lot of the literature on learning and tried to make sense of it within the framework of within an evolutionary framework. And this has been the rationale of the kind of work that we have presented in this volume.
We'll be getting into the discussion of the chapters. Perhaps that's enough of the just getting the set right. And if I could ask the team opposite to introduce themselves as well.
Well, I'm Mike Dewar. I am recently retired from the University of New Mexico. I've been on the psychology department faculty here for the last 36 years. The last 2 years of which I spent on the dark side of university administration. So I haven't been creating much original data lately. But I came out of graduate school with degrees in both experimental psychology and clinical psychology. In experimental, my emphasis was on learning. And I came from a department that described itself as a behavioral department, but it was behavioral in the Hullian or Spencean sense, in that it was methodological behaviorism, or as we now call it, cognitive behaviorism. And I thought that I'd be able to put together the experimental and clinical aspects of my training and have a real kind of science-based approach to therapy. That was called behavior therapy at the time. Its underlying theories and epistemology that were clearly mechanistic and structuralistic, and I know we're going to get into that stuff as we talk about these chapters, which was dissatisfying for me. And I think at about that point, I ran into Steve Hayes, who introduced me to stimulus equivalence and then later to relational frame, and started doing some backwards translational work, laboratory-based translational work, to see if we could identify the processes by which meaning and stimulus functions transfer in an untrained or indirect way. And that sort of was characterized the research that we did for a while. And then more recently, I have become interested in higher order or more complex kinds of human interactions. I think the kind that Eva refers to in her book, the third and fourth dimensions of evolution, complex human language, symbolic communication, culture. Currently, I'm interested in meaning making, and I think for humans, the real functional continuities that are operating are not around the utterances of simple words or mands and tax and autoclitics, but instead much more complicated kind of verbal utterances that attempt to make meaning out of the world. And in particular, I'm interested in the interface between that meaning making, whether it's constructed by other people or generated by ourselves, as they interact with continuities of reinforcement in the real world. So that's me.
My name is Derek Hamilton. I'm a professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of New Mexico. And so my interest in learning began with the study of complex forms of learning that are kingdom common and that all animals do them, particularly spatial navigation. So when I was a graduate student in the 90s, the prevailing view of how mammals, for example, solve spatial navigation problems is through representational strategies, cognitive mapping, and there was a lot of debate about whether associative principles could be applied to explain these complex forms of behavior without appeal to the representational structures. That was really my point of departure into the area of learning and memory, and it's been a principal interest of mine for the past 20 years. And one of the things that I'm keenly interested in is the various constituent processes, behavioral processes, sources of stimulus control in the spatial domain that can contribute to acts of getting from one location to another, and the complexities with which those sorts of strategies can interact with one another that go far beyond a simple elemental explanation that is based on one sort of explanatory construct. So about that time, I met Mike Dewar and started thinking about how to apply contextual approaches that were becoming popular in the field of behavior analysis to those problems as well. For the past 15 years or so, I've been studying spatial learning and its neurobiological bases from this perspective of constituent processes that have various sources of stimulus control that interact at a process level, and trying to understand that process from a neurobiological basis and then apply that to disorders of brain function. So for example, when structures that are involved in these interactions aren't functioning properly, can you use that to interrogate the function and better understand it, rather than looking for the neurobiological bases, say, for a particular representational construct or hypothetical construct, rather using the neurobiology to constrain thinking about what those processes are, how they interact with one another. So I'm coming at this from a somewhat different perspective in that I'm interested in neurobiology, but I'm interested in neurobiology from the perspective of what it can tell us about learning processes and complex forms of learning.
Okay. And so maybe we could proceed just to a brief restatement of the chapters themselves. Of course, the people who are reading the précis of our discussion will have read the chapters, but some people will see these tapes separately, and so it will help give them a context to have a brief summary. In no particular order, perhaps I could go back to Eva and ask for a 5-minute summary of of what you contributed to the volume?
What we were trying to do was to look at basic distinctions that are used in the learning literature, the distinction between classical and operant conditioning. And we discovered, because we wanted to understand these types of learning, because these are the general ways in which organisms become conditioned to the aspects of the world, and their actions become reinforcing. So we needed to understand this processes at depth. And when we looked at the literature, we discovered that the distinction between classical and operant condition, the nature of the distinction between these processes is still an open question. So we tried to understand the difference between these processes by using functional and evolutionary criteria, and we found that it is very difficult to justify this distinction as it is usually used from a functional and evolutionary criteria, because it seems that the process of learning about the world and the process about learning about oneself, although they may involve some slightly different mechanisms at the level of even the molecular level, they nevertheless seem always to come together. They are entangled. So, and we're unaware of any organism that possesses one form of learning but not the other. So we don't think that these processes are disconnected in any natural ecological conditions, although they can be disconnected to some extent in the lab, not operant not operant and Pavlovian conditioning or classical conditioning, but rather world learning about the world outside one, and learning about one's own actions. So there are some, as I said, there are some indications that the implementations in the brain may be somewhat different, but nevertheless, functionally, these two types of behavior are, two types of learning are entangled. So what we wanted to look at was coming to this question from an evolutionary perspective and from a functional perspective. What we wanted to try to understand differences between between types of associative learning, and see whether we can suggest some kind of classification that can be useful for certain purposes, especially again functional purposes and evolution, understanding learning through evolution. And we suggested that associative learning became increasingly more flexible during evolution. And since it first emerged, we believe, during the Cambrian era, very many years ago, about 540 million years ago. We proposed distinction between two major levels of associative learning, limited associative learning and unlimited associative learning, that are nevertheless hierarchically and evolutionarily related. But we think that they are nevertheless functionally and evolutionarily distinct. This classifications into progressively more complicated types of associative learning, limited and unlimited, offers some testable behavioral predictions, and we think it can be used to guide future comparative research on the evolution of learning and the evolution of memory systems. And of course, associative, our notion about the evolution of learning does not stop with just limited, unlimited, but it goes further. It goes also to episodic-like kind of learning, and also eventually to symbol-based learning. But our basic classifications between limited and unlimited associative learnings offers, we think, testable behavioral predictions, and it can guide future comparative research on the evolution of learning and memory, as I said, as well as shed light on very difficult questions such as the emergence of consciousness. In fact, we believe that unlimited associative learning is an evolutionary marker of basic phenomenal consciousness, and if it is, then understanding and then identifying it in different animal groups could tell us which of the many species of animals that we encounter is minimally phenomenally conscious. This is just one example of the many important implications of this kind of distinction. So this was this was one of the strong motivations of this research. But of course there is also the inherent interest in the evolution of associative learning, which is one of the greatest adaptations in the history of life.
Awesome. If I could turn to the other team, and you can divide it up any way you want, but together, if you could spend about 5 minutes saying what you did in your chapter.
Okay, I'll give a brief overview of our chapter, and then I'll let Derek handle the more difficult questions. So we started out, actually, I'm happy with the way that we approached our chapter, because I think that the two chapters elucidate an important difference that we have to acknowledge right from the beginning, and that is the basic approach that we're taking to understanding the phenomena called learning. So we start out, we try to provide a historical context to appreciate at a larger level the differences between these two major approaches in psychology in general, learning in particular. We call these mechanistic versus functional approaches. Now, I know there are other approaches, but I think these are the two that dominate. Certainly mechanistic or structural approaches dominate mainstream psychology. They dominate learning theory, and they dominate cognitive science. There's other approach called the functional approach that is certainly less dominant, but has continued over the years in its own way, sometimes hidden, and the efforts are not as well known as more mainstream approaches, but it's the approach that we adopt. We try to elucidate the different approaches through the issue of spatial navigation, and gave some examples of work that was based on mechanistic or structural approaches, and then some work that Derek did that took a more functional approach to understanding spatial navigation that allowed for a finer grain analysis of the kinds of stimulus relations that were involved, the kind of stimulus control that was involved in spatial navigation. With respect to learning, we opt for this functional approach. I think that a paper that was written by Jan de Houwer and Dermot Barnes-Holmes, and I can't remember the third author, but I think the third author, last name is Moores, that appeared in Psychonomic Bulletin and a Psychonomic Review and Bulletin, where that really took on the definition of learning and tried to describe it as an ontogenic adaptation. And from a functional perspective, that fits perfectly, because we focus on functional adaptations. That's how we understand learning. And so understanding that aspect of learning, or that approach within an evolutionary perspective, made a lot of sense to us, in as much as these are both selectionist-based models, and that they're just selection at different levels of analysis, I think. So we were trying to make the case that we think that functional approaches to learning are preferable. And again, these are, this is a matter of taste and preference. This isn't a matter of scientific certainty. There aren't data you can bring to bear on those kinds of assertions. It depends on what your goals are for a science. And our goals with respect to prediction and control, or influence over behavior, suggest that a functional approach is a more useful way to go about this. We end up making the case that this fits very nicely with a recent description of contextual behavioral science, which places itself within evolution science. And so we give an example of how this would look by describing relational frame theory, not in its entirety, but its basics, and how it provides a nice account of one of the four, at least one of the dimensions, if not two of the dimensions that are described by Eva in her colleagues in her earlier writings, and that is symbolic communication. We talk a little bit about how each of these perspectives can be useful for the other, and in particular, how considering evolution of relational frame theory contextualizes it as an outgrowth of evolved cooperation. And that was a useful insight that I think provides for a better at least able to answer some of the questions around why would we be doing relational framing? Where does relational framing come from? What's the background to that kind of activity in the part of organisms? And then suggested ways that taking a functional approach might inform evolution science as well. So I think that summarizes our chapter.
You want to add a few things there? Short, brief.
Well, I guess the only thing I want to add, unless you've got some things that you saw from the chapter, Steve, that you think I should talk about.
No, I was meaning that Derek might want to climb in, but.
Oh, Derek. Okay.
Yeah.
So we sort of discussed earlier that I would probably take that question, but Derek, if you have stuff to answer, please go ahead.
Yeah, it's good. It's if we've done that, maybe we could get right into the questions then. Maybe a good place to start is just this odd fact that the evolutionists and the learning folks, although they overlap so much, it's a relatively, it doesn't seem like has been historically a vibrant conversation between those two wings. And here we are having a conversation. So I thought it might be good to step back and just say, why do you think that is? That the two fields have at times seemed separate, even though both of them talk about the other aspect periodically, but not in a way that has led to a robust back and forth between them. Or maybe my characterization is wrong. See if you agree with that. But if so, why is that?
Well, I'll take a crack at this, and I think you're right that there's an irony to this, that the two fields have not overlapped very much. On the functional end, the behavior analytic end, it's surprising to me because, again, Skinner bases operant conditioning on evolution. That was the model. And he talks right from the very beginning about learning being, operant conditioning being an ontogenic adaptation in the same way that evolution is an evolution at the phylogenetic level. And then you've got a number of authors within the functional camp that have been calling for this this combination. And again, there are similarities. I mean, even going back to E.O. Wilson and B.F. Skinner having conversations between the two of them about how similar the epistemologies are and shouldn't we get together to do something here, and they never did. And some of that, I think, has to do with professional contingencies that operate on scientists, and that is that it's very difficult to publish in other people's pastures. And when behavior analysts start talking about evolution, I think they do so in a very naive way. I think that they oftentimes don't know some of the current topics in evolution, and so there's kind of a naive adaptation of the language that evolutionists don't find very compelling. Especially when you're doing research in laboratories with pigeons and rats in these Skinner boxes, it doesn't really look like the kind of behavior that people are studying in natural environments. And so, ecologists weren't particularly interested in the kinds of things that were going on. And then on the other side, the more structural or mechanistic side, there has been attempts to integrate that. There were books written in the 60s and 70s about learning and evolution. And pretty much those books bemoan the fact that there's no interaction. And again, I think the terms are used in different ways. I think evolutionists sometimes throw up their hands at our naivete when we talk about evolution. And I think learning theorists do the same thing when evolutionists try to talk about learning. And or you don't really understand what I'm talking about. And so they go on their separate ways, again, trying to satisfy the contingencies operating on in their own life around publishing in their field and grants and editing and things like that. So again, a lot of yada yada about this, but very little interaction. And I'm not sure that we're even talking about the same kinds of phenomena when we have this dialogue. So,
may I?
Yeah. Yes, please.
I think that some of the reason for that is that basically learning was seen as an ontogenetic kind of behavioral adaptation, and evolution is dealing with phylogeny. that between organisms, the inheritance of variations that are transmitted between generations, not within a generation. So although there is a selection principle which is common to both, which is leading to kind of internal evolution, if you want, in the nervous system, in behavior, and so on, and there is a phylogenetic kind of process, these processes were seen as very, very different. And they were applied to, one is phylogenetic and the other one is ontogenetic. And there were theorists from the very beginning, such as Herbert Spencer, for example, that tried to unify the whole picture by saying, look, these principles are going across the board, and if we have, we have to, when we're thinking about evolution, we have to think about evolution at every level of organization, from the physical to the cultural, to the symbolic and cultural, and so on. But this was criticized for many reasons, some of them good reasons, because sometimes this kind of big abstraction, this kind of universal Darwinism or universal evolutionism was the kind of analogies were too broad and sometimes missed the point of what each particular discipline was trying to show in a rigorous manner. So I think this is one of the reasons. People have tried to understand the evolution of learning itself as a subject. I mean, we can think about Baldwin, for example. Morgan, Baldwin, people like that were thinking quite a lot about this topic. Waddington and other people were also talking about it. More recently, we can think about Gottlieb in the United States, Gilbert Gottlieb, and we can think about Patrick Bateson in the United Kingdom. There were people always who were thinking about these things, and obviously, they were trying to understand them. But it is. I think that what happened was in your chapter, Mike and Derek, you are pointing out that a lot of the way that people are thinking about the evolution of learning became very, very kind of specific and ecologically focused. And that is because I think of this, the problems, the historical problems that people encountered when they were trying to generalize without understanding in detail the kind of general strategies of associative learning in the broad sense. And trying to understand how these things can actually evolve. What do they evolve from? What kind of scaffolds do they create for the evolution of the fine-tuned, sometimes ecologically specific adaptations, behavioral adaptations of organisms? But what are the general strategies on which all this is built? So I think that there is some historical reasons, disciplinary historical reasons for this kind of disjunction. I think that we're today in a state, in a very different place. I think that a lot of people, especially when they're thinking about human evolution, I mean, it is quite obvious that you cannot understand human evolution without taking on board symbolic evolution, the ability to think, to understand, the ability to understand relation, to think in terms of relation, to think in terms of abstractions, and in terms of to generalize in the kind of specific way that humans generalize, that goes beyond the categorizations of animals. So that's one thing. I think also today we understand a little. We begin to understand a little bit, and we can see the communalities between these different processes without being with. And today, I think the communality, we can understand them in a way that does justice to the specific implementations of these principles in different in molecular biology, in the cell, in very simple organisms, and in much more complex organisms, and even in ourselves. So I think today we're in a very different place. But I think that because of this distinction between this is phylogeny, this is ontogeny, and they're different, and we have to think about them differently. I think this was a very important part of the reason. And also the sweeping generalization that were made around the selection principle, which is absolutely important and absolutely central, but it has to be qualified.
One of the changes that seems is happening, and neither of your chapters really dealt with this in detail, but it's a context for it, is that, I was, as a student, taught to think really of evolution is relating to the organism itself, and then ontogenetically, that's modified, but with no sense that it could go in the other direction.
That's right.
And then, and now, I was just 2 weeks ago, I saw an article in Science trying to make the argument that instincts were the echoes of ancient learning that had been, and
it's providing
a more mechanistic account of how that could happen in terms of genetic assimilation, which completely turns it cattywampus. It's not just niche construction or selection, but maybe even all the way down to these kind of genetic accommodations. How do your different perspectives touch on this larger issue of the directionality? Because you between these different domains, which the double-headed arrow, or the arrows going in one direction or another, if you understand what I'm asking.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, my own approach is very much a developmental evolutionary approach. And I start from the organism. I start from the phenotype in context. So it is a phenotype kind of first approach. The first thing that organisms do is they don't wait for life-saving mutations to happen. They're active, they learn, they change, and they're plastic. Most organisms are very, very, very plastic. There is no organism that isn't plastic. Such an organism would go extinct very quickly. Of course, there are different types of plasticity. Plasticity is shaped in different ways in different organisms. But plasticity is a primitive of biology, of biological organisms. So organisms, first of all, adapt ontogenetically. Those that can adapt ontogenetically and have the genetic, epigenetic, whatever preconditions that allow them to adapt better than others, and also the context in which they can develop this, they will be better adapted to the environment. And this biological infrastructure that supports this kind of adaptations will be selected if it has a heritable component. And very, very often it does more than one, not just genetic, but also epigenetic. And in social animals, also social, and in humans, also symbolic. So it is phenotype first at every level of the phenotype and in every context in which the phenotype lives. And genes, in this sense, are followers in evolution. This is a phrase that Mary Jane Eberhardt used. Genes are followers. They stabilize what has been achieved ontogenetically. This is what happens. This is how we should look at this. So, of course, the ontogenetic adaptation, in my opinion, in most cases comes first, and it is followed by genetic adaptations which stabilize it, fine-tune it, and so on.
We have, in some ways, a difference in our basic units of analysis here. And so Eva starts off with, she's interested in the phenotype and the organism. And from a functional perspective, our basic unit of analysis is a relationship between the organism and that environment. And so when I think about going backwards, how a functional approach to learning might go back, it doesn't go back on the organism necessarily. It goes back on the susceptibility of that organism to genetic influence. So one kind of relation affects another kind of a relational unit, one having to do with genetic selection and the other having to do with ontogenetic selection. So that's sort of the way I think about this, going back and forth. So Derek, I don't know if you want to turn your mic on. And
there's an issue of scales, both with respect to populations, where we're talking about individual organisms modified by or having behavioral modifications occur in relation to selection by the environmental stimuli. As the organism experiences them, scale at the population level, and then there's a temporal aspect as well. And I don't want to double back to the prior point, but just to briefly point out that the concept of selection as it relates to evolutionary science is universal, and I would say in the field of learning it's not universal amongst all learning theorists or experimental psychologists interested in learning. So there's not as much in the way of mass action in the field of learning for this concept of selection, as there is an evolutionary science. So from the perspective of our chapter, what we're presenting in terms of selection by environmental stimuli, there simply has to be a capacity in the organism for that sort of selection process to take place. The issue of then is that maintained in the species and involves a heritable component, is a different question or at a different level of analysis. And I don't know if Mike agrees with me or not.
Could I ask then, both of the chapters have dealt with sort of taxonomic considerations to a degree and definitional ones. How does these definitional and taxonomic considerations then, what difference does it make going forward in terms of the kinds of research that may touch on the relationship between these two domains? I'm kind of asking a so what question, but not one that's cynical. I'm just asking you to consider like what is the function even of the scientific activity we're going through right now of trying to get clear about what we mean by learning and how to think about it taxonomically. Could we look at that? Could this issue help illuminate why that might be important?
Well, I think it does, because in reading the other paper on associative learning and the various types of associative learning, there are assumptions built into that term, just the use of that term, that there are these associations, and these associations are structures. They exist at a neurological level, or they exist at some sort of conceptual level, and there's an assumption there that these really are associations, and that the organism stores them in memory. I think a different approach if you take a more functional approach to this, and you think about learning as a word that is used in an abstract way to talk about behavioral changes in response to environmental regularities, you can see that there's sort of a different emphasis there. Now, the emphasis now is no longer on the organism, although we assume that the organism is responsive to the environment. That's one of the things it inherits. But what is it? What is that responsivity, and how do we know about that responsivity apart from what it is that the organism is responding to? And what organisms respond to are regularities. And the distinction between classical and operant conditioning that's brought up in that chapter is, from our perspective, not so much a difference in systems or mechanisms or underlying structures as much as it's a difference in the kind of environmental regularities that can influence behavior. And so we are susceptible to stimulus regularities. If one stimulus regularly precedes another stimulus that has biological significance, then we get a response called classical conditioning. And if we're sensitive to the consequences of actions, then we have operant conditioning, and it's a different kind of environmental regularity. I don't know how to think going backwards about what that means about the organism, because I know that evolutionists typically focus on the kinds of neurological changes or the systems that are evolved that allow for this kind of thing to happen. I look at the environmental regularities and use that as a marker for what evolution is allowing us to do. So I guess that's my confusion. I don't know what I would want evolutionists to tell us is, how does evolutionary selection prepare us differentially to respond to these environmental regularities? And again, I'm not sure that at the neurological or biological level, that's where the answer is, because the biological system doesn't do psychology. It does biology. It does the things that neurons are supposed to do. You've got these kinds of emergent processes that come out of that. But I don't think that we're going to get some isomorphic mapping of these abilities onto some neurological state or neurological condition. We're not going to be able to catalog all of the different neurological responses that give rise to an image or give rise to susceptibility to conditioning. And so that's the question that I have. As a functionalist, how does this help me?
Talking just about response, adaptive response to environmental regularities as a definition of learning is insufficient. There are all kinds of regularities in the world to which organisms respond. For example, changes in the light, in the amount of light plants get during the year, and they respond to these regularities in a very, very specific and very highly adaptive way. Nevertheless, we shall not call these responses learning. And I think that we have to start with some kind of definition of learning. A definition of learning as a strategy, as an ontogenetic strategy for dealing with recurrent environmental regularities of all kinds of types, which has some special properties. And I think that one of the special properties that it does have is that it involves, it's a very special kind of behavioral adaptation. Not every behavioral adaptation is like that. So what is special about this behavioral adaptation? And I think that the classical way of approaching this, talking about something that happens to the organism, it has to have some kind of receptors, some kind of sensors that allow signals from the environment or from the body to get into the nervous system, if we're talking about neural organisms. And this needs to lead to some kind of adaptive response. We also require that some aspects of the reaction that the organism undergoes are retained within this organism, so that when this kind of conditions reoccur, this leads to a change in the response in the first time. So there is some kind of retention, there is some kind of memory. We have to assume memory of this, and we have to assume not only that things are retained, but that can be recalled. So there is some kind of recall process. Now, this is something that is not that plants. I'm not saying that plants can't learn in this way. By the way, I think they can, and I think that there is evidence that they can by very, very simple processes of habituation, sensitization, and possibly some very, very, very limited associative learning. Even there is one recent paper on the behavior on the responses of peas. Their growth towards the light, which can be conditioned by wind, through mechanoreceptor kind of very interesting paper, but it does not distinguish between specific sensitization and Pavlovian conditioning. Nevertheless, it is associative learning, right? Or in very simple, it is. So I think that we have to think about that. And then we have to think about the implementation of this. And it can be implemented in very, very different way in different organisms. And I think that you're right, that it is very naive to think, and when we're thinking about mammals or we're thinking about humans, to think that we're going to find simple neural correlates of this behavior. I mean, the correlates that we shall find, if we shall find, it will be extremely high-level correlates that are better described in cognitive terms, for example, or than in very fine-grade neurological terms, because at the lower levels there is you can't do this reduction in the same way that you can't do a reduction of a trait to a gene. You can't do it to. You have to think about gene networks. You have to, and very complex gene networks and their products and different levels of organization and so on. So I think that we have to qualify what we mean by learning, go beyond the adaptive response to regularities, and try to find out about how this is implemented at different levels of organization. And this leads me to Stephen's question. I think that one of the things that that could help us is that we need to, the kind of distinctions and categorizations that we make allow us to think about different levels of selection, about different types of inputs into the organism that can be processed or can be dealt with in ways that lead to adaptive responses that can lead to some kind of cumulative evolutionary output. So I think that this category, and we also need to understand where does it come from. So if you're starting with a very, very complex system, it looks like magic. I mean, and we want, as scientists, we want to understand what is the basis of this. So that's why people go to simple organisms, not because they think that complex organisms and simple organisms are the same, but because they hope that that what they will discover about simple organisms will give them some kind of cue as to how, where do we start? What do we have to take into account? Very often we don't even know that. So I think that's why this kind of distinctions are useful. For us, they are useful. This distinction that we're making in our chapter between limited associative learning and unlimited associative learning is useful because when we're trying to figure out what's behind this, how, for example, what do you need? What do you actually need for this kind of unlimited associative learning, this unrestricted kind of learning that requires this perceptual fusion and requires chaining between many, many actions and requires second-order conditioning and all that. When you're actually analyzing this, trying to reverse engineer it, trying to see what it entails, you see that it demands quite a lot from the system. Several levels of hierarchy are needed in order for this to happen. You need to have a dedicated memory system. You have to have integration systems, association systems at different levels, sensory association systems, motor association systems, systems that associate the motor and the sensory, and so on and so forth. And when you're thinking about it in this kind of way, you see, well, that's a very complicated system. And even the system of limited learning, we went to and tried to do, we don't present it in the paper, but we do present it in a book that we're going to publish, hopefully. We tried to look at the taxonomy to see, okay, this is what we know about, for example, limited associative learning. How is it distributed in the world? Who has it? So we looked at all kinds of groups, and many animal groups have it, not all. One of the reasons that we say not all is that there are groups about which no work has been done. So we simply don't know what they do, how they can learn. But we know that certain groups can do it. And what is very interesting, in every case that we found limited associative learning, we found that the animal has a brain. Why? Why does it have a brain? We asked ourselves. I mean, that was a surprise to us, I must say. We didn't expect it. We thought that limited associative learning will be found even in animals that have a diffuse learning nervous system. That, in sea urchins, I mean, there are some indication that maybe sea urchins have very, 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 very limited associative learning, and they seem to have lost their brains, by the way, during evolution. The brain has been lost like many good things. But anyway, okay, so it's very interesting. So we asked ourselves, why? Why do you need, even for that, a brain? And even this is a very demanding task to learn in this limited way. So, so once you understand this, you can appreciate the complexity that is required from something that seems to you like a relatively simple system, a relatively simple type of learning. And then you go to a more complicated one for this unlimited associative learning, which is nothing like symbolic. It's much, much simpler. Crabs have it, we think. Yes. But nevertheless, this already requires such high-level integrations, such hierarchies, such dedicated memory systems, mushroom bodies in insects, in arthropods, for example. All kinds of central complex, again, in insects, hippocampus and cerebellum in invertebrates. Really, I'm just talking here about dedicated memory systems and systems of multimodal integration. You're looking at this and you're saying, God, wow. And, and we're not yet at all at the level of humans or anything like that. And we're not even at the level of creatures that can imagine and can dream and can plan. So, but if we understand that, maybe we can understand the next stage and the next stage. So I think this is why this classification, and if we see the distinctions, when we see, for example, when we're comparing the limited and the unlimited, we see that the unlimited associative learning requires higher level integration centers. It requires dedicated memory. It requires things which are not required at the lower level. So there is a real jump in organization there. So we learn something about it, which we can maybe use and I think we can use when we are thinking about creatures like ourselves.
So with respect to definitions that might be mutually beneficial for merging the areas, I teach a large undergraduate learning class at the University of New Mexico. And one of the things we struggle with through the first part of the class is how to define learning in a way that's scientifically useful. And in the earlier part of the 20th century, the first 70 years of the 20th century, definitions of learning were quite complex and really populated largely by elements that had to do with what learning is not rather than what it is. So, for example, not transient state or just a brief adaptation or responsiveness to environmental factors or state of the organism like fatigue or drug states, but really having to do with experience in a way that modifies behavior in a relatively permanent, although that's somewhat of a vague way to state it, because there's lots of disagreement about what sorts of timescales might need to be involved to call something learning or not. But one of the things I think that emerges out of the exercise of going through various schools of thought and how they viewed learning is that there's predictive value and adaptive value in what's acquired, and that can be said to be true of classical conditioning or instrumental conditioning. And forgive me, because I'll fall back into saying instrumental conditioning instead of operant conditioning, just semantic division between the two types of learning. But there's predictive value there. So one can imagine a very simple system with classical conditioning where maybe the time scales are very brief, but the fact that one stimulus being contingent upon the presentation of another stimulus in close contiguity with one another is critical. And the same for behavioral consequences with respect to instrumental or operant behavior, that there's a requirement of close contiguity, but ordered in that one thing happens before another so that there's predictive value. And if that can be acquired and not just be a simple response, like Eva was talking about adaptation to, say, features of the environment like temperature that aren't predicted by stimulus. Now, experimentally, we usually want to see this take place with stimuli that are neutral and have no learning history for the organism. But the main point I'm trying to make is we might see predictive value as one of the things that's sort of central and what might be selected for at one scale that would help organize a definition of learning that would be useful for this sort of integration. The concept of the unlimited associative learning that Eva is talking about might then expand that predictive capacity to all sorts of other kinds of complicated situations. So, for example, contiguity might be very important for very simple organisms. But we know in higher order organisms, contiguity is neither necessary nor sufficient for learning. The blocking phenomenon of Kamen shows that it's not sufficient, and transformation of function studies show that contiguity is not necessary for modification of behavior based on experience. So nonetheless, maybe there's some central features like prediction that underlie both forms of learning, and perhaps both forms of learning co-evolved separately in organisms that had this very capacity for modifying behavior based on predictive value of experience. So I think compared to, say, the more mechanistic school of of thought that we've talked about in our chapter, where we might talk about the products of learning, like what sorts of representations are happening in nervous systems. That leads to a very different, I think, trajectory of research questions one might add or ask, and how those might be integrated into larger questions about evolution. Right? So explaining that a stimulus that's predictive of some aversive outcome 500 milliseconds in the future is difficult to explain with just possessing an association between those two elements, because the critical timing of the unconditional stimulus in a classical conditioning situation has to be something that the organism can have. I don't want to impart agency in this way, but there has to be some predictive value of when that stimulus is going to occur that would allow the organism to be prepared for the delivery of that stimulus. So simply appealing to a representation doesn't, it's an underdetermined problem. You don't have enough information to predict what's going to happen in the future using that sort of construct. So I would say the functional definition that Mike and I have talked about in our chapter, where the issue becomes the environment is a predictor of what's going to happen in the future, and you don't need to appeal to the association of the individual elements to explain that. Now, that may very well be something that's happening. I mean, everyone may be right about their own approach to learning. I think the question we're trying to get at here is what's going to be the best way to frame how we think about learning for bringing together learning science and evolutionary science.
I absolutely agree, Eva, that there is a complexity to this that cannot be ignored, and that there are higher levels of learning. There are more complex kinds of learning, and things like retention must be accounted for in whatever account we have. But where I get concerned is when we say there must be retention, therefore there's memory. And then we start looking for the memory, and we start looking for the physiological basis of it and the nature of it, what it is like as a mechanism. And I think that takes us away from where we want to go. And I think that that's what we're seeing in neuroscience right now. So what's happening in neuroscience is we're starting to identify parts of the brain in terms of the functions that they serve. So you start to hear things like hippocampal behavior. Instead of configural learning or complex associations, we start to identify this with the part of the brain or the part of the nervous system that seems to be involved with this. Well, the outcome of all of this is that there is no memory. There's no one thing called memory. Memory's all over the brain, and so I think that this leads us, from my perspective anyway, in trying to get a better handle on these environmental regularities and how they have come to influence behavior and how we can control it better. What I'm interested in is the value of unpacking these systems or this complexity is to the extent that they can say something about environment-behavior relations. They can inform us about the kinds that ought to be effective, how they got to be effective over the years. You can get operant conditioning at the neuronal level. I mean, neurons respond to the consequences. So you can show that. I think Edelman showed this stuff early on, where he was able to actually condition neurons. So I see that this operates at a lower level, and I'm not trying to make the case that then explains more complex behavior. I'm not saying that at all. But with the complexity, the explanation of the complexity to be useful for me needs to be in terms of the environmental behavior relationships that are allowed by this complexity, not the structures that underlie them, because those tend to be conceptual and hypothetical, not really anatomical. And so, and even if I knew all of that, I'm not. It's based on what we know about learning. So when you talk about unlimited associative processes or associative learning, I like that. I think that's right. That there are more complex kinds of things going on here. But then I'm not sure what you mean by that. So it seemed that this. The unlimited would allow you to talk about higher order conditioning, configural learning, hierarchical control, and those kinds of things. I got that, but what does that add to what we already know about environment-behavior relations? We know that these things are important because we see them in the world. Now we need to account for why they occurred this way so that we have a better sense of how to use these relationships going forward. So I don't know if it was very clear, but it depends. I guess what I'm saying is I'm all for explaining the complexity, but I'd like to see it explained in a way that can facilitate my understanding of these relationships, not necessarily the anatomy or the physiology of the organism, which I don't think maps on to the complexity of the behavior. Okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah. No, I think, I agree with a lot of what you say, but still, when you're talking about relations between the environmental regularities and the organism is the interpreting system of the regularities. The regularities in the environment would be the same for a flea and for a human, maybe the same for a flea and for a human. They interpret them differently. So you have to understand the interpreting system of the receiver. What is it about the interpretation of this type of animal versus this type of animal that makes this animal learn in this way and the other animal learn in that way? And in order to do that, we have to understand something about the details of how these animals learn, and also about the neuroanatomical and neuronal and physiological infrastructure. These animals, I'm a biologist. And as a biologist, for me, when I'm looking at an organism and when I'm looking at how an organism responds, I want to understand what is it that makes it respond in this way rather than in that way, and I need the detailed analysis of how it behaviorally responds, what is coming before what, and how this contingency rather than that contingency affects it, and so on and so forth, and how it all builds up system. I need to understand that. It is part of my research. It is not the end point, but it's not the end point of my research project. I need to understand the interpreting system of the receiver. I'm not taking it for granted. I'm taking it as something that helps me to make sense of what I see. And then I can also ask, okay, how did the system evolve? How did it change during evolution? And I think that you need that this is...
If I could jump in, because I think actually there's a lot of agreement here. I mean, the limited, unlimited one, I didn't see as a structural account, and actually I appreciate some of what Derek was saying. Well, what about, but understand then, if you have a clear unit at the level of organism-environment interactions, and these regularities and the change of that relationship that's based on contacted regularities that are there in the environment, then it does allow you, or does it not, to move backwards into these other dimensions that
Absolutely.
are also of importance, having to do with these more phenotypic kinds of processes. Maybe if I could use an example, kind of the exception that proves the rule. It takes something like taste aversion, where everything that I see in the literature on taste aversion tells me it's a specialized form of classical conditioning. It seems to respond to all of the features that are there. When it was first contacted, Garcia, et cetera, kind of skeptical about thinking about it that way, viewed it as a new learning. I think most people now would look at it as an evolutionary adaptation of a functional process due to this particular importance having to do with food-related stimuli for the particular organism given their ecological history. And food-related outcomes for that organism. So, temperature is important with this organism, sight with that organism, smell with that organism, and this dramatic distortion of temporal parameters where you go from milliseconds to 24 hours. And I wonder if we might give that as a filter, like these different views of learning, do they help us orient us towards the systems that can then be modified in the larger span of time that would be reflected? Like, for example, I would be surprised, Mike, if you would think that it was a bad idea to look at the underlying neurobiology of taste aversion. Given this extraordinary distortion of these temporal parameters, there must be physiological underpinnings of it that would be demonstrable in some way. So I guess I'm just asking this question. We actually have kind of an agreement in a way, and these two different ways of looking at learning. How do they allow us to do this other piece that Eva's talking about that seems important, not as a way of just explaining away or as a substitute for understanding it at this higher level of organization, but as something that, as you do understand it at this higher level of organization, you can look at what's going on in these other dimensions. Am I making sense?
Yeah.
What I would say to that, Steve, is of course I would have no objection to an attempt to understand the neurobiology of learning, to the extent that that is helpful in what we're trying to do with respect to prediction and control. So, but that becomes the test. So when Eva talks about, I want to know what these systems are and what these processes are, I agree, but to what end? And how do you know that you know about them? So with respect to taste aversion, the test for me would be whether or not the description of the system, the analysis, allows me to manipulate taste aversion in the real world, to make more of it, or to be able to interfere with it. Like extinction doesn't seem to work around taste aversion. Why? What would, and taste aversion turns out to be, something to be dealt with, in the real world. There are clinical issues around this. So the test for me would be, does this understanding the system and the mechanisms allow me now to manipulate the environment in different ways? That's the ultimate test for me, not understanding the neurobiology qua neurobiology, which I think is where brain science is right now. It's understanding brains qua brain. That's fine. I get that. But the real reason to understand it from my perspective is, what then can you do with organisms as they interact with the world by knowing about that information?
Well, if you're thinking about that, one of the things that animals that have limited associative learning cannot do is that they cannot learn in a non-elemental way. They have only an elemental kind of learning, right? That's one of the things that they have. Non-elemental learning is a necessary but not sufficient condition for UAL, for unlimited associative learning. Okay, so this gives you a prediction. You can say this type of animals can do this, and we need this brain structures in order to implement it. And we don't think, and if you don't have particular types of brain structures, non-elemental learning just cannot happen. Now, what is it about, for example, unlimited associative learning that interests us? What kind of what relevance does it have? So, okay, so you classify animals in a new way. We think that it has a very, very big relevance. We think that it is an evolutionary marker for minimal consciousness. And if it is, and if, for example, in order to learn in a UAL kind of a way, you have to be able to form the kind of processes that we call consciousness, which include the ability to feel pain, among other things, then this means that we can classify, that we can understand or have some kind of informed idea of which animals, for example, can feel pain. This has huge moral implications. So we think this was, in fact, one of the. We didn't come to the study of learning and different types of learning from just from the interest in the evolution of learning. We came from it from a different, because we discovered that it was the only kind of marker that we could actually use. We couldn't find it at the molecular level because we didn't have an idea of what to do. We didn't find it in the neurological level because we didn't have an idea of what to do. But we could provide, we hope, we think, a good argument for why this is a good marker for minimal consciousness. Now, if we're right, this has huge implications. Huge implications. And I think this is just an example. And, and there are also other things. I think that if you are starting with this, even if we're wrong, let's say we're wrong, and we're really only talking about the evolution of more and more complex cognition. One of the types of cognition that we would really like to understand is our own. Now, how do we go about it? It's so complicated, so very, very complicated. And so one of the ways is to start, as I said, start from something a bit simpler, and then try to see what you need in order to get something really more complicated, and then even more complicated. Finally, maybe our kind of cognition. So this too would have important practical implications. So I think that this kind of approach that looks at the kind of the way of the physiological, not the behavioral, physiological, neurological, molecular implementation at every level. We are pragmatists. We look at every level we can get any information about and try to relate them together and form a picture. And if we can do that, we're very happy, because we think that we can go with that. This would have implication for understanding more complex cognition. This would and in the particular case we're interested in, it will have implication for understanding, for example, which animals are conscious and what is the nature of basic phenomenal consciousness, which is a huge philosophical and scientific question.
Absolutely, and I agree with you. I mean, one thing I think I'd like to ask you though is what you mean by consciousness and awareness. But before I do, I understand exactly why you're talking about unlimited associative learning being a marker for some other kinds of things. But the way I understand unlimited associative learning is the ability to do higher order kinds of conditioning, hierarchical stimulus control, and those kinds of stimulus relations. Well, if we define unlimited associative learning in that way, and then say that these abilities have evolved because we have unlimited associative learning, there's a philosophical problem there, a definitional problem. It seems like we're using as an explanation the very thing that we are saying needs to be explained. We need to explain complex associative learning. And so now we evoke this unlimited associative learning ability, and then that explains complex cognition. So but that's the way it can come across.
Yeah, I'm sorry. So we didn't do a good job we certainly don't. We don't do this kind of circular kind of reasoning. I mean, that is why we're trying to figure out what is the difference between limited and unlimited associative learning. And then we try to see what do you have to add. And then this is something we did not do in our paper, and that you're correct about that, and that's why it was misleading. We don't talk about the kind of ecological conditions which selected for it.
Yes.
Now, this is a very, very, and you're right, we didn't talk about it in this paper. We talked about it in other publications, and we're talking and we're developing this topic in our book. But you are absolutely right. This is something that have to be addressed, because it is obvious that it didn't just pop out from the sky. And we can't take it for granted. I mean, it evolved. So why did it evolve? Under what condition did it evolve? What are the problems, for example, that limited associative learning is presenting to the animal? And how can it be solved? And what does the solution, sort of what doors does it open? Because in evolution, very often what you have is that you solve one problem and then you create another one.
Exactly.
Creating the other one, you open the door, you have to solve it again and again and again. In this way, you end up with really very interesting and complicated and non-intuitive kind of systems. So that's right. Exactly. We didn't talk about that, but we definitely didn't assume that we didn't define as unlimited associative learning. We didn't think that its existence is the rationale for its own evolution. It evolves from non-associative learning under quite interesting conditions. We think that it was one of the drivers of the Cambrian explosion, that associative learning was a huge jump in adaptability, and in some animal groups, it opened the way to unlimited associative learning within a complex Cambrian scenario of arms races between prey and predators, and this kind of huge, which were allowed by associative learning, among other things.
Well, and that distinction makes a lot of sense to me. And what we're talking about are what are the abilities that are defined by unlimited associative learning that aren't there and in limited associative learning. And I absolutely understand that. But the question then becomes, how do those evolve? What was the selection factors of those? And what's the distinction? And that becomes useful. Now, can we talk about awareness and consciousness just a little bit? Because we don't have a heck of a lot of time, but I was very interested in your use of that term, because I think that that your use of it is different from the way, say, functionalists would talk about awareness and consciousness.
Yes, I mean, we can define it negatively and we can define it positively slightly. I mean, it's very, very difficult to give a definition of consciousness, as you know. It's just like the problem with life. You can't define life. You can characterize it, but you can't define it. So it's rather similar. But, consciousness is something that you lose. It's something that is losable in creatures that have it. Or you can lose it when you're in coma. You can lose it when you're in deep sleep without dreams. And when we're talking about consciousness, we're simply meaning the very, very minimal consciousness, the ability not just to process information, but to actually have something we can call subjective experience. Now, it's very difficult to define this kind of thing. And that's why, we sort of, people have all kinds of intuitions about it. And there are many, many characterizations of the conscious state or the conscious animal in the literature. And what we try to do is put together all this vectorization, come up with a list of properties that are something that is a kind of consensus in the literature among the neurobiologists and among the philosophers of mind who take a naturalistic stance. I mean, we are not dealing with people who think that there is a mind-body problem. I mean, we are not, that there is a mind that is separated from the body. We are just not dealing with them because we don't know how to deal. So we took all these definitions and came up with a list of 7 major characteristics. And then we tried to see, well, does an animal that has unlimited associative learning actually display this characteristic? Does unlimited associative learning sort of requires this characteristics? Yes or no? And we come to the conclusion that's why we chose it as a marker, that it does. We don't say that it's the same thing. We don't say that unlimited associative learning and consciousness is the same thing. We don't say it, but we say that in order to learn in unlimited associative learning in this kind of way, you have to be conscious. And there are some experiments. For example, experiments with humans. So people who were presented with a complex picture that required quite a lot of perceptual fusion of a new kind of landscape with flowers and mushrooms and I don't know what. And then they were presented with it, but it was masked, right? And then they were given some nasty electric shock or something like that. They couldn't learn it. When they were presented with the picture afterwards, they didn't react with fear. On the other hand, they did react with fear when they were presented with angry faces, even when they were masked. When they were afterwards showed these faces, yes, they reacted with fear. So there was already something in the system that could be primed. But apparently, in order to create this kind of thing, you need, if the perceptive is novel and compound, you need to be, at least in humans, conscious. Now, nobody did these experiments in animals. We think that there can be very, very important. It doesn't define conscious. It is at least a testable prediction about how you can deal with this kind of proposal. And it seems so far, but we may be wrong, and it was a very restricted experiment, and one has to go to develop it. And me and my colleagues, we hope to do that. We actually hope to do the experiments, create a set of experiments that test this in a more rigorous way than it was done. This is an experiment from 1993. And they see whether it works, and then see if other people can do it on animals. You can present animals with mask stimuli. Of course you can, but people don't do it.
Mm-hmm.
So,
but how do you...
I think, so we think that although it's very, very difficult for me to define consciousness, I think I can say some things about the relationship between complex learning and cognition and consciousness. We think that what we call consciousness, minimal consciousness, very elementary thing, that just feelings and perceptions as real experiences. We think that it evolved in the context of the evolution of learning and complex cognition. So they are related evolutionarily, although, of course, in ontogeny in this case does not recapitulate phylogeny, because babies can feel and they don't have to learn in a complex way, but they have already the system, the enabling system that allows this.
We have a notable time problem. We have only 4 minutes to draw to a close, and I'm excited by the quality of the discussion that we want to continue. But perhaps I could just give you just a minute, Mike. I know you're about to climb in, but by casting it this way, part of what Eva's talking about here is trying to build a foundation that you can then go to even more complexity and to understand it. And I know she and her team have really been trying to dig into human language, some symbolic learning and so forth as well. And I see in both teams that kind of expanse. And maybe Mike, if you want to weigh in on the consciousness part of it, you might also just say, to reflect a little bit on what you did in your paper and so forth in terms of a foundation for looking at even a greater issues of complexity going forward. And then we really are very much at the end of our time.
Right. Well, one thing with respect to consciousness and awareness, which I find absolutely fascinating. I also find the philosophical and neurological work on this stuff to not be very helpful. And I think that they've all given up now, and they just said, well, consciousness is what the brain does, or consciousness is what behavior is. And I think is just given up. And now you're defining consciousness and awareness as subjective experience. And now that just becomes very technically difficult to get into. One way of thinking about, at least the way I think about awareness and consciousness, is the ability of an organism to respond discriminatively to its experience. So now with humans, we can talk about that. Hey, I just felt this, or I just did that. But animals can also respond discriminatively. They can be trained to do that. And that, I think, is a very interesting development in evolution. And that is where language, I think, really plays the most important role, and maybe one of the drivers in all of this, because you've got to be able, if you're living in a social community and people are wanting to know what you're going to do or what you did do or how you did feel, you got to be able to answer that by discriminating yourself from the rest of the group. And that I think is the fundamental unit of discrimination that is critical for understanding consciousness and awareness. So and I'll just stop at that.
If there's, we have just 1 minute. If there's any final comments, we can take them. But
sorry to take so much time.
Discussion, and
we can go on with the discussion. I really thank you very much. I mean, I learned a lot, and it was a lot of fun. Thank you, and thank you, Stephen, really, for this opportunity.
Yes.
Well, and thanks to the entire team for the quality of your contribution, and we see it here in the quality of the discussion. I found the 90 minutes disappeared just like that.
It did. Another 90 minutes at least would be necessary for this, because I think this is really interesting stuff. And I think what you're doing here, Eva, is fantastic. I loved reading this. I didn't understand.
I enjoyed very much. I mean, I agree with so much. And so I was thinking, what am I going to talk about? I mean, I agree with them.
Well, now this is an interesting thing, that this project, David Sloan Wilson and I are coming together, and I've seen this now in team after team, that there really is a deep interconnection between these teams, and not because we structured it artificially. And I hope going forward it blossoms in another way, which is that people actually find use to the conversation in the particular things that they're interested in. I think you can see some opportunities and doors opening in our conversation in this area. And so thank you for that openness, and let's see where the fields take us. Other people will look at those tapes and maybe be inspired to continue this dialogue. So thank you to the entire team. Wonderful conversation.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.